Hey everyone, it's Christina Holub or Dr. Holub, and we are taking PH 507. It's a really important class in this program. It has a little bit of a duality to it. We are talking a lot about research methods while at the same time writing your proposal for your thesis and capstone. So unlike maybe some of the other core classes that were subject matter and some writing, this class is a lot of work on both ends, subject matter wise and your own writing for your thesis or capstone. So always feel free to let me know if you have any questions. But again, this is a really important class and I'm really excited to teach it and help you get through your proposals. Okay, just a little bit of course detail. Here you have my name and my contact information, office hours. I'll have free Wednesdays online, but I know especially being most people are working full-time, always feel free to ask for an appointment at another time. And we could always use Zoom or even talk by phone. And then as you know, the format is online and it's asynchronous, so I'll be aiming to post stuff on Monday, latest Tuesday, but most things are due about Sunday. So that's kind of the course that, that you're used to, that we've been doing thus far. Okay, for this class, there are a lot of learning outcomes, and the ones that I kind of want to highlight in bold are that we'll be talking about key steps in the research process. We'll be developing, your research question for your research proposal. And then, of course, within that, talking about research designs and methods that we use in public health research. We'll talk a lot about measurement and different types of designs. So it's a really good course. It's pretty packed. But the goal at the end is to have a completed and developed proposal, which helps you get through candidacy, which I'll talk about in a second. So for this class, these are the components. You have IRB or ethics training through CITI. Some of you, or maybe even many of you, already have IRB or your CITI certificate. If your certificate includes the social and behavioral, either the refresher or the social behavioral research methods part, I forgot the actual name. If you already have that, then that's fine. You could just send me your certificate. I think the due date here is September 15th. But if you have another type of CITI certificate, it could be for like clinical lab or something that doesn't have the social and behavioral component to it, then go ahead and do that part of the CITI training. So that is what is required for this class. And more information and directions are in week 3. But I'll go ahead and open that up sooner so that if you want to get ahead and do your CITI training, you can do that as well. So again, that's the first part of it. And then you have 2 exams. So you have a midterm and a final. The reason I have exams for this class is because we are going through a lot of material. I want to make sure we're capturing that and that you are kind of reading through the chapters and studying along. And then the second part of the class is working on the proposal. So that's why we have exams in this class as well. So then you have your proposal, and then you have the presentation of your proposal, which is either going to be in week 6 or week 7. Week 8 is the final exam. And then we have points for participation and professionalism per usual. So that's kind of the grading system for this class. So for this class, I'll be doing a lecture or a mini lecture followed by a writing lab. And in person, it's a lot easier to have people stay in the room and I go and walk around. But in this case, we're actually going to be doing a lot of mini meetings because I don't want to lose that aspect. I do want you to dedicate at least, I used to say 1 hour, but for this class, at least 2 hours or more to the writing portion of this. And then once you've done either an hour or 2 hours, schedule a meeting with me that week just to kind of touch base. But I definitely want to meet with everyone within week 1 or week 2 to kind of go over your topics. And then I might call or have other meetings just to keep along, because I don't want to lose that aspect of kind of continuously talking with you about your projects and helping you adjust and adapt, etc. So we'll be having more contact and one-on-one meetings for this class. And then on your part, just make sure you are reviewing the slides. For the most part, when I post the slides that I'm doing voiceovers, I've kind of just summarized them or taken out material that you could review and read. And then do make sure that you're reading through the chapters, because again, we have the midterm and the final exam, so there's a lot of content, and at the same time we're doing a lot of writing. And then if you look at my schedule, I do have the check boxes for the major points for this class, but there also may be some mini assignments that I might say, for example, week 4, where there's nothing due, I might say, hey, can everyone send me a draft of your background and significance, because that's what we would have done the week before. So there are some mini assignments in there, but again, for this course, the ones that have check boxes are what you need in order to progress through the class. Okay, your thesis or capstone project, I'd rather see quality writing than too many pages. So I've kind of whittled it down to 6 to 8 pages. As always, we're using APA style. I'll say mostly citation style. And the components of your thesis or capstone will be background and significance. So really setting up, what is importance, where is the gap, and you should end with your research question in this section. And then your methods. So how are you going to conduct the work? What are you measuring? Who are you measuring? All of those details. And then you'll have a data analysis plan. One thing that I've done since the beginning, which works really well, is to have students do table shells. So what you're doing is imagining what are your results going to look like. And you're actually going to create your result table shells, but just without the information or the data in them. And just by doing this alone, it really helps you to conceptualize and think about what is it that you're measuring and how is that information going to look in a way that you're going to be able to interpret. So it's always good to have your analysis plan, but also including some table shells, which is essentially your tables with no data in them. And then you'll want to talk about implications. So what is the meaning? Why is this work important? What can we learn from it, and what might we have to do or think about in the future? So just a page on kind of implications of the work. And then very loosely, it doesn't have to be too detailed, but we will go over, is there a budget? Do you need funding or gift cards or incentives? Most people don't, but just in case you do. And then resource management. What are some things that you might need to complete your thesis or capstone? And in this section, most importantly, what is your timeline? And how are you going to manage your time to make sure that you complete everything and are able to graduate on time? Because this week and kind of starting off this class is so important, I took out all the information about thesis and capstone, and I actually am doing a separate video and PowerPoint slide on that just to make sure that everybody sees it. I didn't want to put it at the end of this lecture. So again, I have a separate video and PowerPoint slide talking about how we're going to start setting up and developing your thesis and capstone project proposal. So make sure to look for that second video in Cougar Course. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, advancing to candidacy, that is kind of the goal for the end of this class. So really, to advance to candidacy, you should be a student in good standing with an overall GPA of at least 3.0. You should have completed 501 to 507. So again, right after you're done with this course, you should be eligible as long as the next 2 points that you've passed GWAR and that you have successfully proposed your thesis or capstone to your committee or to the faculty who are going to be on your committee. So again, these are the 4 criteria for advancing to candidacy in this program. Again, it's kind of a balancing act for this class. I kind of mentioned we have a lot of research methods content, but we also have a lot of writing. So again, I'm going to have more one-on-one meetings with everybody so that I can kind of make sure you're coming along and we're talking about any adjustments or edits that need to happen early on. So by the time you get to the end of this class, you're ready to propose and have your committee listen to your proposal, and then have that be your last check mark to advancement to candidacy. Here's the lecture part. Okay, so for this first one, and again, I'm just pulling out some slides, so be sure to look over all the slides that I've posted that are kind of the standard, and then also, of course, read the chapters that are associated. So this one is really on key steps in the research process. It's all about rigor, and the reason is the more rigorous, the more valid the study findings. You know, you don't want a study to be sloppy, because then you really don't know if it worked or not, or if the results were actually meaningful. And if there's rigor and we know the study results or findings are valid, then that's what leads to improved practices or health promotion programs, basically the ability to translate that. So if we can improve practice, then that in turn, again, improves overall public health outcomes. So again, it all boils down to rigor and how you're conducting your research. There's a 9-step process, and I'll briefly go over this because the next 9 slides are each step. But the first part is identifying your population. Who is it that you're working with? Then coming up with a question. You know, what is the research question that you're tackling? So these are some decision points. And then figuring out what's the best approach. Is it observational? Is it experimental? And again, it has to do with your question. So what is it that you're asking, and how are you going to be able to achieve that? Next is now selecting the research design. And you want to select a parsimonious design, which is the most simple design. So you might have, it's good to have a simple question, and you don't want to start developing a very complex study with multiple components and multiple phases, when in reality you could answer the question in a very simple design. So you always want to think, you know, what's the most simple way to achieve and answer the question that you put forth. So once you kind of know your research question and your design, now you're asking, okay, what am I going to actually measure and how I'm going to measure it? From there, you want to figure out, okay, now I know what my research question is, I know the design, I know who I'm working with, but now you have to select your sampling method. Is it going to be convenience sampling, you know, surveying off the street? Is it going to be a random sample, you know, representative of your sampling frame or your population? You know, what is the sampling method going to be? And then you take action. Now you're implementing the study, you're cleaning and analyzing the data, and then you're answering and basically looking at your findings and also thinking about dissemination. You know, who should know about your research, community and or academic. And then the process doesn't end there. So now you have some answers, but with answers you always have more questions. So how can we improve something? Maybe something didn't pan out the way you thought. So, you know, what other factors are related? So there's this kind of always asking questions, and I think that just goes with having a curious mind or a scientific sort of inclination. Okay, so again, here's step 1. You know, what's the population? I like these slides because I feel like I'm going on a car ride with the second line. It's choosing your destination. Like, where are we going? One way to start thinking about who or what you're going to do is to look at national priorities. So if you think about Healthy People 2020, I wonder if we have 2030, I don't know. We're really close to 2020. But looking at, you know, what are the priorities that have already been set forth, and that's something that can guide the selection of your target population and even your research question. You can see what are priorities around different topics. And if they align with something you're interested in, what a better way to kind of align yourself in that way. It's imperative that your study is squarely aimed at those who can benefit. So you have to think about what is the goal and who are you targeting to benefit from this work, and your studies should really reflect that. And a lot of that has to do with sampling and sampling methods. So thinking about, are the people in your study really the ones that you are hoping will benefit at the end? Otherwise, there's a mismatch, and if you're not using or thinking about how you're aligning the two, you may come up with results that actually doesn't apply to those who you actually intended the work to benefit. So really just make sure those are aligned with each other. Developing your question, mapping your route. So one rigorous study involving one simple research question is much better than having a ton of questions and doing a less than rigorous study, or one that has a lot of flaws. So again, it's better to be simple and do it well than to make it complex and then not do it well. I think that's kind of life in general and multitasking, right? But that's the same principle here in research. A good research question neatly fits into the chain of evidence. So you're looking at the literature and you're identifying gaps or places that need further investigation. So you really have to really understand and have a complete understanding of the literature and the topic that you're interested in, so that you can neatly place that research question to add to the literature or maybe even verify. But you want to make sure that there's rationale in what you're asking and the research question that you're developing. The next step is, is this going to be an observational or experimental? So choosing your ride. Not all research is created equal. And I would say not all questions are created, research questions are created equal as well. And broadly, you choose the right method depending on your question. So even though there's a gold standard for cause and effect, and we know that's a randomized control trial, if that's not the type of question you're asking, then that's not the research design that you should be implementing, if that makes sense. So here we're talking about observational studies are far more amendable to completion in a short amount of time. That makes sense if you're observing something that's already happening or that will happen. The time frame is usually shorter. And then when you get all the way to experimental studies, that is the only way to establish cause and effect type relationships. For your thesis and capstone, just be aware that you probably, unless you're already an experienced researcher, we really caution you against attempting to do your own study, or especially experimental study. Just based off experience, and then logistics and timing. But again, kind of on timing, you really have to think, what is practical? And I'll actually talk a little bit more about that in the other video when I get more in detail about your thesis and capstone. But just really think about the design. I think one of the best advice that I got as far as thesis, capstone, or finishing up my dissertation was, don't try to save the world now. Just graduate and then you could start. And that just kind of made sense to me, because a lot of times you want to do too much. But again, the same with the research design. Keep it simple, finish it well, and then you will be, well on your way to doing what you really want to do in your career. Anyhow, that was just a sidetrack. Let's get on to step 4. So step 4, which lane to drive in? So which research design is best? I kind of alluded to that. It really depends on what's most efficient for your research question. Again, simplicity is best. You don't have to do something complicated when you can answer your question with a simple design. So here are a couple of designs to think about: observational versus experimental. There's qualitative research where, words are your data and you're looking for themes, within the, like, either transcripts or focus groups, things like that. And then you have cross-sectional. So you're looking at one point in time, or panel studies or prospective cohort studies where you're following a group of people and observing that way, observing behaviors, for example. And then you have your experimental type research. There might be pre-experimental studies. You might not have the opportunity, or it might just generally lack randomized random assignments. And then you have your true experimental. Again, it's kind of the gold standard, talking about randomized control trials, where you're able to randomly assign your participants to either the intervention or the control. And sometimes, with just practicality or even ethics, you're not able to do that. And that's where you kind of get into the quasi-experimental designs, where you might have one group that is receiving an intervention, but you are selecting a group for comparison. So it's not random, you're selecting the group, but at the same time, it's still an experimental design, so that's why it's called a quasi-experimental studies. But again, this is just kind of a broad picture of the different types of research designs in a spectrum from observational and experimental research. Step 5, pick your variables carefully. So stopping for snacks. Measurement is everything. You can't really get the results and interpret and understand what's going on if you didn't measure, it correctly. So you need to decide, what do you need to measure to answer the questions that you ask? So kind of working backwards. What are you asking? What is it that you are hoping to see as a result? And then kind of work backwards. How do you measure that, and what do you measure? There are a lot of things to take into consideration that you want to think about a priori, meaning beforehand. Are there things that are other factors that could be correlates? What are the predictors? What are the larger outcomes? What are the independent versus dependent variables? Are there mediators, moderators? So you really want to sort of think about these things in advance. But for this class, we will keep it simple and thinking about what are the main variables that you want to measure, again, that match to the question that you're asking. So step 6, decide on the sampling technique. So do you take the bypass? That one I don't get. But anyhow, rigor is largely dependent on the quality of the sample you select. So, and again, it's always a function, or it always depends on your research question. So if you really want to generalize to a larger community or population, your sample has to reflect the best way possible that population. Some sampling techniques could just be, I think I mentioned, convenience sampling, where whoever walks up to you in that moment, you're asking a few questions. But that's very different than trying to make implications or sort of practice, for other communities or populations. But again, the most important part is aligning your sampling technique with your research question. 7, implementing your study. So implement with fidelity. So should you use autopilot? Probably not. My answer to everything is it depends. Even the best plans can and will go wrong if you're not being very careful about supervising and thinking about quality control. A really good researcher is obsessed with oversight and making sure that the procedures are going well and that everything is being collected the way it should be. Everything that really just defines the study. You're basically the manager of your research. You're managing daily tasks. Sometimes it might seem kind of mundane, but at the end, it's all about rigor. So when you implement and you actually conduct the research itself, make sure you're doing it to the best of your ability and that you have protocols in place and you know who should be doing what and where and when, and that you're implementing with fidelity. 8, now you have the data. Analyze the data. You're arriving at your destination. Of course, this is everyone's favorite part. Just kidding, not everybody. But again, you want to follow your analytic plan with precision. You basically want to do what you said you're going to do. Report all your findings, even if it does not support what you thought or your hypothesis. That in and of itself is great information. Like, oh, I thought, this was going to influence, X was going to influence Y, but in fact it doesn't. That is actually a good finding as well in some ways, to say, well, there must be something else going on there, and then boom, you have another research question. But it's really important, especially around publication bias. You don't always want to just only publish, positive results. So that's an issue. But just make sure that you basically are following the plan, and that you're doing everything that you're going to say that you're due for your analysis, regardless of whether or not reports. I've had some theses that had 3 hypotheses and none of them panned out. But, it didn't mean they had to scrap their whole work and say, oh no, now I can't present, or now I can't do anything. It's just that you have to really think about maybe why didn't it work, what are some potential explanations or other implications or future work. So there are ways to really think about it when it doesn't pan out the way you want, but you do what you say you do, and report your results as you intended. And never hesitate to ask someone to help you with statistics, whether it's a peer or if it's faculty. So make sure you're getting the help that you need, especially when it comes to analyzing data. And the last part, disseminating the findings. So prepare a trip slideshow, more like Instagram, right? Now you're transforming your results into your actual findings. So this is kind of the context of your findings, and well, here context is key to really thinking about, what is the interpretation, how does this contribute to the literature or research in general. And then when you share your results, dissemination can take place, whether it's presentations, writing a manuscript in a journal, media releases, broadcast, social media. And let me add too, especially if you're working with communities, that you're disseminating to community stakeholders, who is of interest, who is benefiting from your work, and who should know about it. Oftentimes we just think about the academic side and publishing, but if you're working especially in community-based work or community-based participatory research type work, you always want to share back to the community as well. When you're writing up your results, talking about implications, one thing that is really common is sometimes people kind of overreach and when they're talking about their results. So when you're disseminating your findings or conclusions, really keep it toned to what you found. It's kind of like not overpromising. If you found that, X is a predictor of Y, the way you say it is you say it more, and this is kind of like in writing, scientific writing as well. It's very rare that you're going to say X definitely caused Y, especially if it's not an experimental design. So therefore, this is exactly what it is. Another way to put it is, X, may have an impact on Y, and we always say future research is needed to understand the relationship or something like that, but you kind of word it that way. So, one factor, maybe an important variable that could impact, XYZ of what you were looking at. It's never completely conclusive. Like, oh, I did one research project and now I know exactly, what influences XYZ, whatever you're looking at. So just don't overreach your conclusions. Maybe more so overstating is the right word. Don't overstate the results that you found, and keep it really toned to what you found. In this one study, we found that these two things are related to each other. Maybe you don't know cause and effect, they're related. So just kind of keep it toned and pitched to the actual work that you're doing. Okay, chapter 2 is has a lot about theory, which you can also review, and a little bit of philosophy of science as well. I think one of the main points that I just wanted to make sure everybody knew, and I know you know this, but the difference between qualitative and quantitative data. So qualitative comprises words. They could be key informant interviews, focus groups. It could even be from a diary or anywhere that has words. The way you analyze qualitative data, and I've done it both ways, by hand and also by using qualitative, analysis software, which we'll actually do in this class. But you're trying to organize words and codes, once you start coding, into larger themes. So that's qualitative research or working with qualitative data. And then quantitative is what most people, are used to, and that's numbers where you can analyze information, use statistics, and come up with, numerical findings. Both are equally important. They can be and maybe should be used together, especially when your research question elicits that combination. And that's what we kind of call a mixed methods approach, when you're using both qualitative and quantitative data to inform your work. Okay, chapter 3 covers ethical issues and a little bit of IRB. So this is something you can review. It's very classic. You are also completing your IRB or city certificate, which goes through a lot of modules online. So that also helps with this chapter. But really, it boils down to 3 main principles. And the first one is respect for persons. And that is having full disclosure of risks and benefits of the research, respecting the autonomy of a person to make an informed decision. So there's where your informed consent comes into play. It's very critical. And it's a process. If someone does not want to participate, that should always be respected and never challenged, because you are respecting the right of that person to participate or to not participate. And you're also disclosing as much information as possible to give them the best information for which to make a decision. Must consider how context affects decision to participate. Think about, this kind of reminds me of one study that I was a part of where we had cameras. So a lot of people like asking a person to wear a camera all day. So you really have to think about, who would be amenable to this and who might not be, and really just respecting, again, the decisions of people, but also understanding the type of research that you're asking people to do, and understanding, how that might affect someone's decision to participate. So sometimes you might have to make adaptations or tweak something that you thought you wanted to do, if that's not something that people are responding to. But again, it kind of just involves respecting persons. So again, that's one of the first concepts, is respect for persons. The next one is beneficence. This is the goal of research must always consider the welfare. So it's avoiding harm and reducing risk as much as possible. So again, benefits must outweigh the risks. And risk can really take any form. It could be physical, psychological, psychosocial. So it could even include the risk of the, how much time or burden someone has to do to be a part of your work. So again, beneficence in general, just the benefits must outweigh the risks. The second really important principle in ethics in conducting research. And of course, the third one, justice. So you should always ensure that the work that you're doing is reasonable, you're not exploiting, and that you're really considering the procedures, and that they are fair and equal. So kind of something that I mentioned earlier is that whoever is a part of your study should be the beneficiaries of that research. So think about who are you aiming to benefit, and they're the ones who should be included. It also kind of goes to the rigor. You want to make sure those two are aligned so that the results or your findings actually apply to who you hope benefit. But this is also a justice issue. You want to make sure that the people who are participating in your work are also benefiting in some way, directly, most likely indirectly, of your research. So populations who would benefit directly, okay, scratch the directly I said before, should not be excluded. Sorry, I mixed that sentence up. Populations who would benefit directly should not be excluded. So again, sometimes the benefit is long-term, so that's kind of why I mentioned indirectly. But basically, whoever is in your research project should benefit. Age of consent is 18. Under 18 must provide assent. So it's under 18 consents, but then that's called assent, and you usually get a parental consent again. But anyhow, sorry I butchered that one a little bit, but again, the third principle that's really important is justice, and the main idea is that those who are participating in your work should benefit. And again, that kind of also has to do with rigor in making sure that who you want to benefit is actually going to be a part of your work so that the results actually apply. So again, this is an issue of justice, another really important principle in ethics. It's also federal policy that women, minorities, and children be included in research whenever possible. And if you are excluding, that there must be a really good rationale, whether it has to do with your research question or who you're targeting. But whenever possible, women, minorities, and children should be included in your work. And we also have protections for vulnerable populations. And what this means is that there's a higher level of scrutiny. You might have extra or alternative procedures for consent that you might have to do, but this includes children, prisoners, pregnant women, and human fetuses or neonates. So those are populations that are highly protected. And you could expect to go to a full IRB review and have people really scrutinize your research, again, to make sure that these vulnerable populations are being protected in the right ways. So what is IRB? I kind of mentioned it already. It's the Institutional Review Board. It is the entity, whether you are in a university or in another setting, that reviews your research and largely around ethics. Are you conducting your work in an ethical manner that is protecting human subjects? Can research be exempt? So do you always need IRB? You don't always need IRB approval, but you always need IRB to recognize the work or acknowledge the work that you're doing. So there are 6 categories of research that are exempt, meaning they don't need to go for further review. You don't have to include, certain things, even sometimes consent, depending on what you're doing. But there's times you might be doing secondary data analysis. You still want to submit an IRB proposal, and exempt is usually a lot shorter, just to say, hey, this is what I'm doing. I think I'm exempt because I'm fit into one of these 6 categories. And you get a letter back from the IRB acknowledging that, yes, your research is exempt from proceeding, with IRB. Some of these 6 categories have to do with, typical and usual research that happens in the education setting, testing, exams, for example, and also other types of research where maybe you are collecting information, surveying, even doing a little intervention. But if you are not collecting information where the participants can be identified, so it's especially if it's anonymous, but also if it's confidential, your work may be exempt. So it's very low risk, we'll say. Expedited, there's 7 categories, there. And that is where there is some risk that warrants an expedited review of your work. And so that is what you're doing for the expedited portion. And then lastly, especially when you're working with vulnerable populations, you have a full committee review. And that is when a committee gets together, you have a primary reader and maybe even a secondary reader of your work, and they give you comments. They might even go back and forth with you about asking you questions. But again, you have the full attention of the IRB committee to review the work and make sure that it is done in a way that protects, again, human subjects. For CSUSM, you usually submit during the academic year. You can also submit during the summer. For this class that is taking part in fall, you want to submit IRB as soon as possible, as soon as this class is over and you have proposed your work and it has been accepted by your thesis or capstone committee. Then you want to work with your chair of your committee to submit to IRB and get that approved. A couple of terms I just want to make sure you know the difference. Anonymous, absolutely anonymous. You can't link any information. You don't know who filled out your survey or gave you the information. Completely anonymous. You can't figure out who it was. Confidential, you might have names. It might have to do with the consenting process where someone's listing their name, or you might have a need to link a name with the data, but the information is confidential. And that's where you usually typically use study IDs. So again, anonymous, just as it is, completely anonymous, versus confidential, where you might have sensitive information, but it's not in a way where you can connect it easily to the data, and again, it's kept confidential. Deception and debriefing. So sometimes, and I think this is a little bit more rare nowadays, you might have to deceive participants, especially as part of an experiment. But I would say what is more common now is incomplete disclosure, let's say. So you're not disclosing, exactly what your research question is to your participants. So it's kind of more of you're disclosing, but it's incomplete. And I'll give you one example. When I work with participants and I give them an accelerometer to wear, I don't say to the participant, I'm going to look at the minutes that you are doing light and moderate and vigorous activity, and my goal is to understand if it's above or below 150 minutes recommended. I say, where you're going to wear an accelerometer and it tracks, generally it tracks movement. And then I just give them instructions on how to wear it, and I'm not emphasizing, I really want to know your physical activity level, and kind of giving that away. And sometimes that's to not, I don't want to say incite, or kind of inspire the participant to say, oh, you're tracking my physical activity, now I'm going to start running. Well, now you're not capturing the person in their normal state as you intended. So sometimes that's why there's not full disclosure of exactly your research question and exactly what you're looking at. So again, incomplete disclosure. But whether you're doing incomplete disclosure or there is some deception involved, at some point there is debriefing. So whether it's at the end of the study or another time that's appropriate, you should always let your participant know what were the results of the study, what were you looking at, etc. And then again, we kind of already went over assent versus consent. Assent is for anyone under 18, and you usually also need a parental consent. And then consent, anyone over 18 can do consent to be a part of a research study. And when we talk about risk, it's not always risk of being physically harmed. There are sometimes less obvious types of risks. So that could be loss of confidentiality, disclosure that someone is participating in a particular study. That could be sensitive, potentially embarrassing. Similarly, social and emotional risk. So sometimes there's sensitive or potentially embarrassing content, or it might be triggering. So there's some risk there. There's also reporting issues, especially if you're a mandated reporter. Court subpoenas could happen, especially if you're working with some type of information that might be of interest. There's other kind of forms and things you could do to work around that. But that's a risk. And then also just general risk or side effects of treatment, kind of broadly defined. So it could be the side effects of being a part of an intervention, could be medicine, could be physical activity. So that's kind of broadly defined. But just remember that risks are not always as grand as you might think. Those are obviously important, but there are also lots of examples of less obvious types of risk. And then coercion. You want to make sure that you're not coercing people to participate. And remember, that has to do with ethics. So you want the respect for the person, right? You want them to be able to decide, yes or no, I want to participate, and not be challenged and not feel like they have to. So you really have to be careful when you're conducting studies in a school-based setting, prison, in a clinic. You know, someone might be receiving treatment somewhere and they're being asked to participate in a study. You know, do they feel like they have to in order to receive quality care? Workplace, do you feel that you don't want to make someone feel like they have to do something because their boss told them to? And then the other one I skipped over but I wanted to address is high monetary incentive. You don't want people to participate because they're benefiting from the type of incentive they're receiving versus truly and voluntarily, without any type of coercion, could be monetary, you know, truly participating in the study at a voluntary because they want to, not because they feel like they have to. So just kind of be aware of different settings that could lead to coercion, and then just in general, again, respect for persons as part of ethics, that everyone should have the ability to participate or not participate if they like. And these are also really important principles that are often in your consent form, that a person can withdraw from a study at any time without giving a reason. There should never be any penalties, and I always include in my consent forms, you know, the relationship between us or this organization that we're working with or this program will not be affected at all. So you make it clear that there's no, you know, social penalty, but there's also no other type of penalties. People can choose not to answer any question, so they can, you know, skip a question without having to give a reason. Benefit must be greater than the risk, beneficence. Consent, as we've been talking about and alluding to, is the cornerstone of respect. So making sure you are respecting the person and their ability to decide if they want to be a part of research. And consent is interactive. It's not, here's a form, you know, sign it. It's, let me tell you about the study, you know, read over the form, let me know if you have any questions, and making sure that the person truly understands what the research or the work is about and what they're going to be involved in. Chapter 17 is an introduction to scientific writing, so be sure to kind of review this chapter, each section, and what should be in the intro, what should be in your methods, what should be in the results and how you present that, discussion, etc. By now you've had some writing experience and APA writing experience in your other classes with mini literature reviews, so just be sure to look at this chapter as well for more tips on scientific writing. Okay, so for this lecture, I'll end here. Usually I add another set of slides, but it's really important, and so I decided to take them out so that everyone is sure to see that we do have a writing lab for week 1, and in that PowerPoint and video, I'm going to talk about setting up your thesis and capstone. So make sure you head on over to Cougar Course, find the link and or the PowerPoint slides, and be sure to listen to these sets of slides really carefully, because not only does it set up your thesis and capstone, it sets up, you know, how you're going to finish the program, and even at a more micro level, how you're going to finish this course. So it's really important set of slides, and make sure to look for the link, and I will see you there.